Hey everybody, how's it going? Hope you're having a great finish to your week. Welcome to the Team Coaching Zone. I'm Krister Lowe, and today we have a really special guest, Abigayle Wall, Abby, who's going to be joining us on the show. Hey Abby, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Krister?
I'm good. I'm in rainy New Jersey. We've had just a cloud hanging over us, which I don't mind because it was like just a desert for a couple of weeks. So now we're getting rain. But you're in Dallas, so do you guys have hot dog days of summer yet? Or
We are
yeah,
getting there. We are certainly
yeah.
getting there. We've had a lot of storms lately, but we finally
Okay.
hit our sunshine
Yeah.
phase of the year. So we're nice and hot, and it's been
All
fun
right.
spending the weekends on the paddleboard. So,
There you go. Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, that's one of my goals for this summer is also to get a paddleboard. I'm about 45 minutes from the ocean and I've been eyeballing. I'm a little older to start surfing. I did a little bit of surfing when I was young and I was like, I don't know if I'm too old to really get back into surfing, but I was like, well, maybe a bridge would be paddleboarding because I noticed some of the paddleboarders surf when there's
yes.
waves, but that looks pretty cool. But so great to have you on the show, Abby. I know of your work for a couple of years, and I've had some of your colleagues at JPMorgan Chase, Gabe Abella and Adam Shu. And I should probably qualify and say you're not speaking on behalf of your your company today, and you have a really rich background in technology, leading software teams around products and developments, teams of teams. But you also have a rich background as trained in ORSC and Kanban, and lately the Cialdini Institute. So I think we have a lot of interesting background just to learn about, and then we'll kind of dig in along the way. But just want to say for any of those who are listening in today, you're welcome to drop comments in the chat. If you're live streaming on YouTube or LinkedIn, you can punch in questions or comments throughout. So feel free to do that. And Gabe, great to have you here listening in today. We'll got to get you back as well, Gabe, on the show soon. So Abby, let's go back a little bit. So you are currently a VP organizational transformation and coaching at JPMorgan Chase. You're working with products, teams, and whole organizational systems. So I'm really excited to learn about that. But again, mention that you have an eclectic background in Agile, Kanban, ORSC, and Cialdini Institute. But let's go back to your early days. I think for 20 years or so, you've been in tech. You were at Dell for a while. You've been at JPMorgan for a while. Do you want to talk a little bit about a little bit of the elevator speech of how you got to where you are today in your career?
Yeah, I always call this my beach bum to boardroom journey, right? Because kind of my first big girl job, right? I was living down in Florida. My first job, my parents had a software company, and so that was kind of out of college, I was hanging out on the beach in Florida, and my parents said, "Look, we paid for a lot of college. Can you please come out here and do a big girl job now?" So I started in their software company, which was in the healthcare industry. And so it started out where I was doing a lot of consulting, kind of gained some significant expertise in terms of hospital operations, nurse staffing, workload management, and started out as a report writer
Okay.
when I bridged into software. So, kind of the advantage when you work for your parents as your kind of first job out of college is that they're like, okay, look, we'll let you try a whole bunch of stuff out.
You're right.
To figure out what exactly you think you want your career to be.
Okay.
And so I gravitated pretty heavily into that analytics part of their business and helping hospitals look at their own information and say, okay,
Okay.
what do we need to do? So that
Which
was
is a
sort of
big thing, right? I
I
mean,
was
data
sort of the baby
analytics.
coach back then.
Okay. Okay. And then
Under
from
the
there.
tutelage of my mom. um, yeah, but at the point that they decided they were going to, sell off and retire from the software business, um, you know, I was attached to one of their biggest clients, and during that sale, their largest client said, we'd like to bring you in over here.
Oh,
You understand us so well, um, and so they were basically outsourcing all of their technology through Dell at the time. And so
okay.
they got me in there at Dell, and I worked for them for kind of the 8+ years that you see working at
In your
Dell.
LinkedIn profile, yeah.
Yeah.
And what were you doing
Um,
there? It says a business systems advisor, but I'm just curious, what does that actually mean? And but
yeah, that was a fancy title for kind of whatever they told me. Um, so a lot of the times, so I was going into kind of new hospitals that needed to come up on a workload system, on a scheduling system. I was coming in, I was assessing. How they were operating right now, what their nursing practice was, and then helping them incorporate their practice into a tool. So it's basically working on the instrumentation, so that they were able to have, visibility into how they wanted to work, how they were handling patients. you know
mm,
if I know that you take some clients in the health
yeah,
field. You know how tough the constraints are for them. They're trying
yep,
to provide quality care. They've got all these regulations, right? And then they're also trying to have a good customer experience, right? Because they're
exactly. It's a lot of pressures sandwiched from all directions. Yeah.
yeah. And so if you think about those constraints, those all pull against staffing in
Mm,
particular.
mm,
And so that was sort of the first niche that I had,
mm.
my career coming in and helping hospitals understand that stuff better.
Okay.
Um,
And then you jump from that to finance and technology software, continuing on the software data track there. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So um, I had a good friend that had worked at Dell, and he moved over to Chase. And
Okay.
at the point that I was like, okay, I've been traveling the better part of 12 years now of my career at that point. I was like, I think I'm kind of ready to
Mm.
slow down the travel. I don't know whether I even like the places that I live because I'm never home. So I was looking for something, and this is why whatever I mentor people, I'm always like, don't underestimate your network. They can help
Mm.
you find your next job for
Mm.
sure. And so he was one of the people I reached out to in my network, and it just so happened that his team had an opening, and he was like, they think they want a tester, but he was like, every time I
Mm.
listen to my boss talk, they want somebody that's more like you, that does all this, has been this sort of jack of all trades,
Mm.
um, kind of position. So, came over to Chase, started out as QA, but then in the interview, I realized that they need a business analyst. And I would probably, one of the cockier things I've ever said in an interview was like, it's okay, because when you hire me, I know how to do business analysis too. So you'll get that too when you
You get
hire
two
me.
for one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably one of the cockiest things I've ever said in an interview, but you got to assume the sale, right? You got to,
Oh, there you go.
if you don't think you're worth that, how is a
Right. Right.
company that
Right.
doesn't know you going to think you're worth
Well,
it?
there's a saying, fake it till you make it. But in your case, you weren't faking it. So that's the good news. Yeah. You actually had the skill. So
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So tell us how, you kind of got really, it looks like from your background, you got into Agile and you became a Scrum Master, and then you found your way to Kanban. And so tell us a little bit about that part of your journey. And, has your work morphed more into coaching, organizational coaching and team coaching and the like?
Yes, yes. So I originally started out as a Scrum Master, and I sort of got
Mm,
tapped when Chase decided, oh, we're going Agile,
okay.
right? And my manager at the time, he was like, go figure out. He was, at this point, I
Mm,
was doing their release management and their project management and their business
mm,
analysis and their QA. So he was like, just go figure this one out too for me. I
okay.
was like, okay. And so I went and I started reading about Scrum, and I was like, okay, how do you get a certification? And I
Mm,
just kind of started down that path. And I think that's maybe 6 months in
hmm.
is when I ran into the two colleagues that you mentioned before, Gabe Abella and Adam Shu. They were starting to do, the
Similar.
agile
Yeah.
transformation coaching in the line of business that I
Mm,
was in. And
hmm.
so they were doing some interviews. And I remember my first conversation, I think it was with Gabe, and he was like asking me kind of how we were running things and what we were doing. And I think I was one of the few people that he had talked to at the time that I actually had a product owner from the business.
Mm,
And he said, okay, out of curiosity, how did you do that? And I said, well, I'm really, I have a good relationship with the managing director, and I just asked her. I said we needed
Mm.
one of these, and even though she didn't feel like she had anybody that was going to know that role, I just I reassured her that I'll teach them.
Mm-hmm.
And so she gave me somebody, and then I taught him. I taught that person how to do
Okay.
product owner role.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for those who are not familiar with the different roles in Scrum, can you give a quick summary of what those are?
Yeah. So within the Scrum framework, you'll hear kind of three roles. They have the Scrum Master, who's there to really help everybody understand the process, help execute the framework, ensure that,
Mm.
kind of the
Kind of a
pieces of,
facilitator coach, would you say,
yeah,
Scrum Master? Yeah.
yeah. And you're very
Yep.
team based with that.
Right.
And then you have the product owner role, which they are sort of your customer facing, and they're doing a lot of the requests that are coming in. They're prioritizing the backlog. They're helping, your Scrum team, right, which is your developers, your testers, your, business analysts. They're helping you to understand, what is this request that the customer needs. So it's kind of those three elements working together.
Yeah.
That's the framework.
And would you say the product owner is really kind of a liaison between the team, which is really more of a self-managing team with some coaching and support from the Scrum Master, and then with the customer?
Yeah, they're definitely that liaison.
Yeah.
But they can also help. They don't always have to be sort of the mouthpiece for the customer. They can also, help you get in contact
Right.
with
They can
somebody, right?
facilitate things in
Yeah.
the larger system. Yeah. So then from there you found your way to Kanban University, or what's the link up with? I know you guys probably started in Scrum, but became fans of Kanban. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I had been probably running Scrum for a little over a year,
Mm.
and I was starting to see that like it was hard to get that next improvement and the
Mm.
next improvement. It was like it felt like there wasn't as much, that we had sort of run out of what we could do right within the constraints
Mm-hmm.
of kind of where we sat in the system. And so at that point I started looking for, okay, what else is out there, right?
Mm.
Because one of the things that they have as part of the Scrum role is that you're the continuous learner for the
Mm.
group. So it's also your job, and this goes back to, that team level coaching, you're bringing the new ideas to them and how they could
Mm.
work.
Okay.
And so that's when I came to Kanban, and I learned parts of that, and then brought that into the team. And that
Okay.
was where it was like, okay, we broke through this plateau that I felt like we were on. And all of a sudden we had more ways to improve again.
What was it that Kanban brought that the previous work building on? So it sounds to me, if I can summarize, like Scrum was really good to help teams or the groups you're working with get to a certain place, but then you would plateau, and the ceremonies and just the different roles, that was great. But as the person who's responsible for continuous learning, you were looking to help them kind of go to the next level, and it just wasn't coming from the Scrum framework anymore and the practices and
Yeah.
principles.
It sort of topped
Okay.
out for
Okay.
my group.
So what did Kanban bring then that was additive?
It gave them, because you had mentioned before, right? You have these self-organizing teams.
Yeah.
I would say yes and no, right? So there was elements that they would be very self-organizing around, and then there's other things that, it just, for whatever reason, they wouldn't kind of go there. And so when I brought in things like visualizing the work, limiting how much work you were doing at one time, and bringing some of those techniques, like all of a sudden that broke through whatever kind of mental prison they had been in. And it triggered them to even be more self-organizing.
Okay.
And
Really,
it
it's
was,
visual management and looking at the flow of work, which I think is
mhm.
really a big part of Kanban, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's really about how is it flowing? Do you see things taking longer, or do you see things getting done faster, right? And
Right.
in an organization like Chase, you're always you're never short for demand, right? There's always more things that people want to get done than we have the capacity to be able to do. And so this was a way that we could be able to take what we had and help get even more out of kind of who we had, which
to put this into context a little bit. So it seems like a lot of the teams you were supporting were software developers developing new financial products and services for the bank, right? Is that kind of what you're doing? And these are like, these range from small teams to lots of teams working together. What's a little bit of like the landscape of when you get called in, what do they, what does that look like, the engagements?
Yeah. So, yes, I started out being very team-based, and it was very much sort of piloting. I tried it with like 3 teams. I messed it up on 2 of them. I got one of them really good. So, the one that I did well, I figured out what worked and how did that go well. And then I tried to, do a multiplier. But, as I was creating sort of that social proof in the environment of like, look, we can add these techniques onto Scrum. These can help us scale. These can help us, work better together, coordinate, collaborate even better. Right. Then it was like, I'd get this avalanche of demand, like, oh, come and do that with our teams, come and do that with our teams. Well, then at a certain point, right, you sort of have enough of the foundation there that's like, okay, how do I start connecting these together? And so that was the point where we started, getting into more portfolio management of this, working with bigger and bigger groups of people where, I think kind of pre-pandemic, where I would say my coup de grace was, is that we had gotten all the way up into sort of the MD level, where I had one MD that, she was managing 50 of her own staff, and that filtered to about 200 developers. And we were running it, with that visual management system.
For all 250 people, that system?
Yeah.
Cool. And did you have to get like special training for that, or was it kind of more incremental learning by just moving up levels of system, starting with 3 teams, and then, you started to find your way, or did you have to get some other training for that?
I am a continuous learner. So it was like, once I was bit by the Kanban bug, I kept wanting to learn more and more and more. So I started out just like anybody else could. I was like a team Kanban practitioner and a Kanban management professional. And it was like, okay, I did that for a while, and I started learning, and I was like, okay, how do I know more? How do I keep kind of expanding on the knowledge and knowing more and more and more? And that was, I eventually got my accredited trainer certificate. I got their Kanban coaching professional certificate. And then
I see you have 6 Kanban certifications.
And then just last year, I went through and I have their top credential now with the accredited Kanban consultant, which means basically I could take their whole body of knowledge and then some. So I can go off book to help. I could go off the playbook to help do.
So I'm trained in Kanban, Team Kanban, from Gabe and Adam. And I actually had Gabe years ago come to New York City and do a 3-day certification training for team coaches, not in the software space. And we did Scrum, and we did some Kanban as well. So as a team Kanban practitioner, what do you think is the next level training that one might benefit from, somebody like me? I basically have been using visual management with all the teams. I tend to work with a lot of leadership teams, and maybe people wouldn't think that leadership teams would really benefit from Kanban, but I actually feel like in some ways they may need it even more. It's just the cadences and rhythms of leadership teams tend to be a little bit more drawn out than frontline, project delivery kind of teams. But I have found it super valuable. Elements of Scrum and Kanban, integrating that into my practice as a team coach. But I'm curious where to go next. I mean, my interest is really these large, increasingly the large systems, multi-team interventions. And I'm curious there. I mean, I've played around with portfolio Kanban and project level Kanban, but I'm curious what you would recommend.
Yeah. So, management professional is sort of their I would say their gateway to like all of the upper levels.
Okay.
You know, so you go through, you learn how you actually walk people through the design, right? With their system design class. And then there's, you know, a second class with that certification. So, you know, like team Kanban practitioner, you can do that one, you know, in basically a 1-day class. This one's about 4 days where you learn how do you walk people through the design, how do you understand, you know, what they're doing right now and how you translate that into the visual system. And then the second part of that is, okay, now you have the system, how do you keep improving it? So they teach you some basic techniques there. So I would say that's probably the next.
And is it more geared towards software development, or is not necessarily?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
They, you know, they're in a lot of different industries. I think, you know, I sort of keep up with some of the things that are out there. You know, they've done, I think they even have a class that's newly released that's all around sort of working with law firms. So they've done a lot of work with law firms lately. So
I imagine it's still dominated
tailoring
by IT, but IT software development is still probably dominated, but it is spilling out to other functions and industries. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So is that, you know, still now today in 2023, you know, post pandemic, is still the state of play for you guys in terms of practice? I'm curious, like, you know, the agile movement's 20 years going on, more than 20 years now. I'm curious, what's the state of play in the industry, but also, you know, at JPMorgan Chase?
I would say yes. I mean, organizations are still, you know, trying to work and you know, implement different agile frameworks. I would say that my work has pivoted. One of the things that I've started to realize, especially as I've worked with different parts of the organization, you know, working more with product groups, you know, I've seen a need for understanding that relational system. And, you know, I've come to understand that the work alone is not going to necessarily unite people. Right. So you know, I think that's how we came across each other. You know, I started learning more in the 16 conditions. That's what sort of triggered me to also, you know, try my hand at the ORSC, the organization and relational systems coaching. I took one of their classes, and again, it was sort of the same thing with Kanban. I got bit by the bug off the first class, and I was just like, "Let's go."
What bit you with ORSC?
You know, it was just this.
I've interviewed Marita a number of times. Yeah,
it was just sort of that expansion of my mind, really. You know, it all of a sudden it gave me a framework and some techniques for how do you work, especially in that area of conflict and alignment. Because that was one of the things that I was seeing, is I would see the friction, and we could talk about it, but then getting commitment to actually doing something about it. It was like I realized I wasn't able to have the skilled conversations that I wanted to. And so, you know, I think, and you've probably experienced this, you know, throughout your coaching career, like that moment where you're like, okay, I don't have a tool to pull out. You go back into accumulation mode where you're just like, okay, let me go learn some more. Let me go, you know, let me go find something else that might help. You know, and I found a lot of value from how rich that toolkit is.
Yeah. So now you would say your practice is kind of an amalgam of different influences, and you kind of bring all of that to bear on the projects you're supporting.
Yeah. You know, I do a lot more work right now into building those social systems, especially with leadership groups. You know, because they're not going to naturally just work together. You know, and I think you know this from 16 conditions, right? If they don't have norms in place, right? If they don't have some of the ground rules, if they don't see how they need each other, you know, they're gonna struggle, and that's gonna turn into friction. And if they're, you know, as that friction kind of builds, right, it can take them into a place where instead of being collaborative, they can become very oppositional with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious, Abby, like, so you have a team of people, or how do your engagements kind of look? I'd love to get a little bit into like the arc, if there is an arc, a typical arc, and there might be various ways you get called in to support, and it may take different forms, but I'm curious, what does the arc of kind of some of the engagements look like?
Yeah. So, I work as a partner with Gabe Abella,
Uh-huh.
currently. And so, a lot of times we'll get called in because leaders will be in a place of going, okay, we just reconfigured ourselves, or, we're trying to work with this group and we just don't seem to be able to do that well.
Mm.
Or, hey, we're seeing friction points here, right? We have, lots of people in our organization, kind of understand what we do. And so, we get a lot of ad hoc requests. It's sort of, at this point, our organization has structure in place for how it's going to run agility. And so a lot of times it's like, okay, if the scrum masters and the scrum master leader are at a place where it's like, okay, we don't know how to break through this. That's a lot of times when Gabe and I would get a phone call.
You get the sticky cases.
Yes, we get the tricky ones where it's like, okay, well, what do you do with this?
Yeah. And the issues are around, again, you mentioned like there might be a restructuring or something that then forces a whole bunch of people who may not have been working together to come together and try to sort themselves out to be able to build new products and that kind of thing, or
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we work, primarily around the payments industry.
Okay.
Here in the bank, that's sort of our line of business, is in the payments world.
Yeah.
And yeah, so, very recently we just did one where it was like, look, we have this critical piece of work and there's just so much friction. Can you help us? And so we said, okay, we'll take this on. We'll figure out, what we can do. And to this leader's credit that brought us in, I have huge amounts of respect for this gentleman, because it's not easy, when you are at that director level, to actually say, like, I'm not sure what else I can do here.
Ask for support.
Right.
Yeah.
And ask for help.
Yeah.
But
hardest thing for us as human beings to do. And we wait until we get into a lot of trouble before we ask for help.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so he had the courage to just make the contact and say, look, I need some help here. And it was his first time kind of working with the two of us. And so there was a lot of uncertainty there. And so we had to be really intentional about how we designed, the engagement that we were going to do. And he had a lot of, I would say, anxiety around kind of working in that relational space. He was just like, I mean, we'll do this, but let's get to the work. Let's get to the work that we need.
Well, especially in your space, I think, in a lot of these roles where there's been a lot of people have succeeded because of technical expertise and the ability to drive results. And then they find themselves in these leadership roles, which increasingly need less. It's less about the technical expertise, although helpful, right? And it's more about the ability to lead people and change, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what most leaders have any training in, right? It's more like if you're just naturally good at it, but once you're in role, it's kind of hard to learn in role. It's too late, really.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But the funny thing that happened, so we said, okay, and we had done a design and we got in there on the day and we started executing it. And like at the first break, he was like, forget what I had said. Let's do more of this. Like, this is really what we needed to do.
And what is that? Is that visualizing their work and kind of meeting them where they are, or what does it really custom, or it really depends?
Actually, at that point, we helped them develop a conflict protocol. So that, number one, they could start to understand, the feelings that were there and understand some of the blind spots that they had.
Okay.
But then it was giving them safe space to sort of understand where maybe some of this behavior that say bothers you, right? That wasn't the intention of the person that was doing it, right? And so it was giving them, some tools to understand, the behaviors that people were exhibiting, where that was coming from, and then give them a way to say, like, let's create some commitment here about how we're going to work together. And so it gave them some norms there. And
this is, I think, gets at really when teams are struggling and there's already been some breakages and trust. Really, there may need to be some work to establish some psychological safety, to create some emptying of the cups, to build some empathy and understanding, and like you're saying, and create a space where they can actually then really start to focus more on the task work and the technical work. But it sounds like in this case, it's a lot of relationship work.
Yeah.
Which is really what, ORSC is, organizational relation and relational systems coaching. So is that where the ORSC stuff really came into play? And
yes.
Yeah. Is there anything in there like Land's work or other things like that you're drawing on? I'm curious because Gabe, made a comment that the ORSC took his practice to the next level. So I'm curious, what are some of the things in there to just give a little preview for folks who aren't familiar with the ORSC?
Yeah. For that particular engagement, like I was using toxin grids, which is something that you learn in like their very first class. But it was the way that we were able to use that. It sort of gave
toxin grids.
Yeah. So they say it's kind of the four horsemen. So you have defensiveness, you have blame, you have contempt, and then you have stonewalling.
Right.
And those, there's behaviors that kind of link to those. But what it sort of did for the group is it allowed them to say, okay, this is kind of what I'm seeing. Right. And they realized that they had a couple different toxins as far as how the group was operating. But it got them having a conversation of like, where do you think it comes from? How do you think that it's actually trying to be useful to the group? And realizing, got them back to a place where they could actually see, okay, let's assume some positive intent. Let me not just think that they're doing it to drive me crazy. Like you're not, let's say, Chris, or you and I are working together and maybe I'm being, I'm blaming and you're stonewalling. Right. Well, it would give me a way to say, okay, the stonewalling isn't necessarily because Krister's just trying to make my life miserable. Right. He may be doing it to sort of protect himself because I'm coming in and being maybe very overly driving to you.
Yeah.
Right. Where that from me, that's coming from a place in me that's very anxious and kind of shielding all the pressure. I'm feeling all the pressure. And so that's making me be sort of overly driving. So it gave him a chance to take that step back and just say, okay, is there a reason behind this that I'm not seeing in the moment?
Yeah.
And, what can I do differently?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, with that technique, right, there's the toxin, but then they also give you the antidote. So what could I do that would help me be different than this? And a lot of times it's curiosity. A couple different toxins need that.
Because, I spent a decade before I really got crazy about teams really doing conflict resolution. So I did, I spent a decade working with teams, working with people in organizations. A lot of it was international sector work, but I was just living and breathing conflict resolution all the time, training, doing mediations, doing team interventions. And, and this was because there was a lot of dysfunction, right? And like relationships had broken down and then, had really gotten toxic for long periods of time, whether it was between two people or whole groups of people. Eventually I kind of came to the conclusion that work was really reparative and restorative in a lot of cases. In some cases, too much damage was done, but at least we help people kind of heal up and move on. Sometimes they needed to break groups up and split things up. But, eventually I kind of made my way to team coaching because I felt like I was doing a lot of reparative work, which if I trace the causes back, were usually due to leadership, technical leaders being in leadership roles where they were driving just too much work, not paying attention to people, and also the design of the work itself, like how we actually launch projects and initiatives and how we lead those, and bringing in team coaching. And, still to this day, just like you guys, I tend to get pulled in when things are going wrong because
Yeah.
a big initiative has been launched and nobody's paying attention to team effectiveness. One of my cases from late last year was in the cloud technology space. And, the leader, until I got there 10 months into it's like a huge $1 billion part of their business. The leader hadn't met their team in person. They had never met until 10 months later after a lot of damage was done. And then it was like, okay, spend the money to bring 20 people in, spend 3 days in the person and my bill and everything. It's like, that was a lot of investment of money to try to get the ship back on track right.
Mhm.
So it just got me thinking around how a lot of conflict is unnecessary. I do think there's an inevitable amount of conflict that just occurs. But it's a lot easier to deal with conflict when you've actually created a climate and a context that generally is well designed in the first place. So that kind of led me, I swang the other way where I got really into structural stuff. And that's what really attracted me to the six conditions. But I think it's a dance between the structural and emergent work. It is around the task and around the relationship. And I'm curious about that. How do you think about that? Because I do think we can get pulled in a lot to address pain, but a lot of and then we kind of locate it in the people and in the relationships. But a lot of it is, if you kind of do root cause analysis, it brings you back to how a lot of these systems are formed in the first place.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And maybe because I came from that structural, that's sort of why I sort of passed you in the night, I guess, and gravitated into the relational. But I feel myself flowing back and forth.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why learning 16 conditions, that felt like it was really solid scaffolding for me to flow back and forth between the two.
Yeah. The criticism of 6 conditions practitioners who haven't gone on to the more advanced trainings is that it doesn't value relationships, which I think is misunderstood. But I think the framework definitely puts a big emphasis on structure as a driver of behavior. For sure, I think when you meet a team that doesn't have good structure in place and has conflict and eroded trust and a lot of water under the bridge, you actually have to start with relationships.
And I'm, kind of lately, the more and with the groups that I'm working with, I see just how important that relational element is. And that you can't just assume because this individual has gotten to this place in the organization that they're going to be naturally good at that. It's like, look, probably to your point, right? They got to that position, usually because they were a subject matter expert at something. Right. And so that doesn't necessarily, guarantee that they're going to be really, really skillful at building up relationships. Especially coming from the technology field, like a lot of, software development leaders, they're there because they were awesome coders, right? They could code it. They could code it in their sleep. They could code it, they could fix this really complex thing in 20 minutes, like that's how they got there. And so, what I appreciate is when the organizations recognize that and say, look, we've got to invest in building up those soft skills that isn't where they maybe naturally gravitated to. It just shows how critically important that is too.
I just found in my cases, I think the best team coaching engagements I've been on have been ones where the organization recognizes the need to provide support to leaders during transitions into critical roles of these high performing technical leaders. One of them, I'm thinking about a hospital system where it was a new CIO. She was the first female CIO, first African-American CIO also. And as soon as she got into the role, they tagged her with an executive coach and tagged me as her team coach. And I spent 9 months with that team during that period. And I think, that led, now she's the COO of the hospital system, like a couple years later. I'd love to claim credit that it was my team coaching, our partnership, really, the leader and I. But anyways, I think just the moral of the story there is I think the earlier we get brought in, I think the better we can actually start, not with a negative balance. You know what I mean? Like when you get these teams that are really already broken and dysfunctional, it's kind of like you already have debt you have to overcome, right? So I'm curious, do you feel like at JPMorgan Chase, that's part of the culture around bringing in agility and ORSC and these kinds of things early, or is it a mixed bag? Like some teams, some parts of the organization understand that and will invest proactively versus waiting to get in trouble, like in this case of the example you just shared.
Yeah, I would say, you're with JPMorgan, you're looking at an organization that's 200,000 plus employees
Massive.
around the world.
Yeah,
So, I probably definitely can't speak to what everybody does, but I feel like I've sat in a place of privilege within the various parts of the organization I've been in, where I have gotten to be that person in authority to help.
Mm.
Being given the credit as a coach and having influencers within the organization say, go to her, have her help you, and then me being able to pull that off. And I have it's funny because I have a Nelson Mandela quote that's like in my signature line that it seems impossible until it's done.
Okay.
And that's definitely a motto that I have. It's like, look, give me the gnarly problem. I'm okay with that. Like we'll figure it out together. And that's one of the things I've appreciated with sort of the ORSC body of knowledge is that it's very much the system is smart. It will figure out what it needs. It'll, it has its personality, right? And understanding that my role as a coach is to be the container and then be a container with mirrors that helps them see, all the angles that maybe they weren't looking at before. But that's
also, I expect being an internal person, you've been in the system, you've built a reputation, you have networks, you can influence now, and then word of mouth spreads around. So probably there's a baseline of trust and reputation that you've built, which you can leverage. It sounds like. You kind of mentioned the word influence there, and I know recently you've become a founding member of the Cialdini Institute. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And I want to get a little bit into just like your teaching. You do some Kanban training, and but tell us about the Cialdini Institute and any training, if you're doing ORSC training or Kanban or anything. I'd love to learn a bit more about that.
Yeah. So with the Cialdini Institute, if you're not familiar, Dr. Robert Cialdini, he has a bunch of books out there on influence and persuasion. And I had read them and got curious. And then I realized, oh, he has this class that I could take. I could take the principles of persuasion. So I did that during the pandemic. But it's always an area that I have been interested in. And myself and Adam Shu, who you mentioned earlier, we were looking at that to say, okay, we do organizational change. We know we use these techniques. How are we using them? Is there a pattern to how we're using them? And we were, sort of pairing that up with some of the stuff that we'd done in Kanban. But one of the things that we realized is that as we're doing organizational change, there is a pattern to how you can use these principles of influence. And as I was like going through my own stories, and I was even going back to my mentor as early back as, when I was working for my parents and when I was working for Dell, I was talking to one of my mentors there, and we used to talk about how do we go into these hospitals. And it was like, oh, we always started with the relationship building. We had like positional authority being home office or the consultants, right? But how, the places where you had the most success, like how did we actually do it? And it was always like, oh, we always started from a place of relationship building. And understanding like with Cialdini's, principles there, what are the ones that you have to build relationships? Well, you've got liking and you've got reciprocity. And so it was kind of scaffolding that knowledge with the ORSC knowledge, with the Kanban knowledge, with the 16th knowledge. So it's sort of, I guess, not to steal Gabe's word, but I'm also sort of in the process of figuring out my theory of everything. It's like, okay, I have all this accumulation.
Your
like,
unified theory.
Yeah. So it's a little bit unified theory coming up. But like understanding that pattern and how to use that, it's a topic that on the side and behind the covers I've been writing on. I don't think it's good yet, but once Once
That's
it is,
awesome.
I'll start putting it out there.
Yeah.
But to understand that there is sort of a pattern for how you do that,
Yeah.
when you're in relationship building, when you're helping the organization deal with its uncertainty, what can you use?
Mm.
When you need to work towards the motivation, like what do you use?
Yeah.
You know,
No, I ran
and
across Cialdini's work in my graduate. I was trying to remember because the name rang a bell, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I was reading this stuff because he's a social psychologist."
Mhm.
And I was checking that out. But this is something Gabe and I have got into, the whole idea of socio-technical theory, which was kind of popularized back in the 80s, I think, around in the organization development space. But looking at organizations as social technical systems. And I think a lot of us, I imagine a lot of the folks in the agile world come up very much from the technical side of that. And even Scrum, there's a lot of focus on design and engineering, how things work. It's very structured. There's like lots of structure, right? Getting clear roles and all that. And then there are those of us in the coaching field or who come from learning and development, where it's a lot more focused on relationships and process and people. And what's missing from many of us who come from that side, which is why I really gravitated a bit more to the structural stuff and to agile, is lacking the technical side, right? So it's kind of interesting that we're all on this journey. We tend to interweave between the social and technical side, but you need both.
Yeah.
And sometimes people become religious in one of those camps, and you can get a certain distance. I have found with a lot of the teams I work with the leadership teams, the initial phases of my work oftentimes is grounded in the structural things, but the breakthroughs happen in the relationship parts of the work. And then sometimes if they're really dysfunctional teams, we have to start with the relationship work, and then it pivots to structural, and then it's back to relational again. And it's this just constant interplay. But you
Yeah.
need to be adept at both, I would think, right? And help teams, leverage both sides of their life. Yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think good coaches can recognize the
Mm.
patterns that they're seeing, the patterns of behavior, the patterns, that they're seeing in the work, and recognize which side they
Mm.
need to flow to next,
Yeah.
right? To help the group move forward, to help the team move forward, to help the organization move forward.
Mm.
I think that's one of those marks of good coaching, that they can recognize the patterns.
Yeah. So what are you going to be doing at the Cialdini Institute? You're a founding member of a board there, or what is it?
Yeah, so I'm part of the initial group of influencers. I'll be able to, I can certify for him
Mm.
through the institute, as well as being able to incorporate his body of knowledge into my coaching practice.
Mm.
So I'm sort of in the process right now of how do I want to incorporate this into my own offerings.
Right. Right.
With the, not just the Kanban work, but,
Mm.
leveraging the influence with it.
Uh-huh.
And the nice
Wow,
thing
sounds
is
like
that
the
it gives,
total package between
hopefully,
ORSC and Kanban and Cialdini and all your experience. It's the total package, it sounds like.
yeah, that's the reason for the unified theory of everything that I'm
Exactly.
trying to figure out.
Love it. I love it. Yeah. And so it sounds like you're also doing a bit of teaching though, right? Both
Yes.
internally and externally in your work, or
It's been primarily internally,
Mm.
but I will be doing some things externally, probably this fall.
Okay.
One of the things that I've kind of worked on here and there, and they always say necessity is like the mother of all invention.
Exactly.
So I had created a simulation,
Mm.
which I think you saw
Is
that
that
on my
flow
LinkedIn.
function?
Yes, that's
Hmm.
flow function.
You have a
Um,
website for that? I couldn't find anything online about it.
no, not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Working on it.
A little
Work in
tease here.
progress.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. But I had done sort of an unveiling at the Kanban Global Summit last year in
Okay.
San Diego. And of course, in my very first run of this at the conference was David Anderson. And I had built it as, look, I can teach the
Maybe you
Kanban
should say
maturity
who
model.
David Anderson is for those who don't know.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know who David Anderson is, he is considered sort of the godfather of Kanban. He wrote some of the first books that brought that visualization technique into software development. So that was from his time at Microsoft. So sort of the work that him and Dragos Dimitriev did when they were there at Microsoft. So he's written this maturity model, and I figured out it wasn't the original intention of why I created the simulation, but I figured out after a few runs that I could use it to help learners understand that model better of like, how would you start when you're in sort of a value chain, like you're in a team of teams situation where you're all interdependent on each other. How would you move work through that system? And then how would the maturity model help you? And so at the conference, he's in my very first run of this. And I'm like, great, nothing like, having sort of the godfather of the thing that you're about to do, like sitting in your session. At the end of the session, he said, this is the first sim that I've seen since Get Kanban that I would endorse. He was like, this was brilliantly designed. I was like, I have that on video, right?
Yeah.
So
awesome.
It got a glowing endorsement.
So can you combine like team Kanban practitioner training with flow function or custom kind of thing? Or
so if you think about, right, this is probably, I don't know how far back in your history this is going, but if you remember in the team Kanban practitioner course, you do this simulation called Feature Bond.
Yeah.
Right. It's based on work by Mike Burrows.
Yeah, I've used it with teams. Yeah.
So I took his baseline and used it to do value chain. So the reason why I had created it is I was about to do a scaled implementation with Kanban and Scrum. And one of the teams in there was my pilot team. So they had done all the simulations that I had. And I was like, these guys, they know how to, they know how to break this thing essentially. Like they, so I was like, okay, I need to do something new and something that actually helps this group understand scaling. And so that was when I kind of laid down the bones at the time and did a run of it, understood kind of where the tweaks were. And so I kept running it in some of my internal classes. I did another one where I was working with I'm not always working with software teams. I was working with finance teams, and I said, okay, talk to me about your work. And I kind of I improv this thing on the fly, but they even had sort of a flow of like, look, we don't all do the same things. Like we have handoffs even in our group. And so I sort of did it on the fly with the frame. But it gave them a sense of like, when your teams are handing off to one another, how do we work that? And then how do we look at ourselves systemically and not just as individual teams. Right. And so if you're familiar with, kind of the Kanban maturity model, it's kind of taking you from where you're very team centric into a customer centric and then a fit for purpose place where it's like, okay, I understand there's a customer there. I understand that there's that I don't actually put it all the way into production. Right. Or I don't, I'm not the person that hands it directly to the customer. Right. I'm a link in this chain. Right. And so that's really what that tool does for
systemically. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like I'm going to wait until your training comes out. Maybe we should get one for the Team Coaching Zone audience, a team Kanban practitioner and a flow function workshop or program. So that's something you're interested in. We can talk offline about that. But I do think this is where, like mainstream team coaching, I think the, separate from the agile movement, the coaching field, team coaching has become the kind of the hot pioneering area over the last few years. And, but I do think most coaches are still developmentally at the one team level. Maybe sometimes they're part of larger projects with 50 people that have multiple sub teams or groups and some of that. But I do think we need to help people start to move from one team in the what I'm calling mainstream, or maybe that's not the right term, but in the coaching field, learning and development practitioners to move from the one team to looking at value chains and multi-team kind of systems end to end and all that. So yeah, I think that's where we need to push the practice of team coaching.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with that. It's also kind of the next frontier, even in the agile community. When you think about Scrum is very team based, right? And they've been trying to scale that. So you have, these different frames. And if you read things in the industry, varying opinions on how, well executed or not, those things are, but I think understanding value chains, being able to instrument for value chains, that's kind of, in that space where they're going next. And so I think you're absolutely right. That's where team coaching needs to go next, of understanding, okay, great, you guys are really solid, but how do you connect with the teams to your left and right?
But it's developmentally another jump, right? An order of magnitude jump. And I think that's the big challenge with this work, is like you can't just go attend trainings and then think you can go implement this stuff. You actually have to live it and breathe it with lots of teams and earn your right, almost like earn your way, so that when you start working with more complex systems, you kind of have it in your bones what's going on in any one given team, or the leadership and authority and conflict issues and all that.
Yeah, I would say probably some of the best advice that I've ever been given in my career came from one of my previous managers. And he said, he was like, you're in a privileged position that you're an employee. He goes, treat this place like it's your own lab.
Yeah.
But he goes, be smart enough to figure out, if you mess it up, how to fix it.
Right.
Still, I always say, like, I've done it wrong enough times that I know how to do it right now.
Right. Well, I think what I've learned is I know how to do enough things that tend to go well, and then I usually have a bit of room to try some things out that if they don't go well, it doesn't kill the overall engagement, right? But you have to have some space to do things you've never done before. Otherwise, it gets a bit stale and old, right? So
exactly.
Yeah. Well, great stuff, Abby. Really enjoyed this conversation, and reignited some of my interest in a lot of these themes that parallel a little bit about my background, but I totally didn't connect to the Cialdini thing until we got on, and just the work with ORSC and relationships and all this stuff. So I think it's a great summary for the team coaches out there who are listening around the kind of eclectic, what we all need to bring to the table, which is an eclectic set of competencies and skills. And, I think you laid out a great runway for people to go on and do more learning and training. I want to give you the last word around, as you're kind of moving forward. What are you most excited about, or parting advice, or anything else you want to talk about here before we wrap up today's show? But it's been great having you on. And once you get the theory of everything landed, we'll definitely have you back.
Yes. No, I really appreciate, the opportunity to come and chat with you. And it's been a really fun conversation. I'm really excited about, some of the things with influence that I'm trying to scaffold into my coaching practice. So, I'll definitely give you the heads up when those things are coming out.
Okay.
Maybe once the theory of everything is starting to look more like something, instead of just a bunch of like, these are a whole bunch of themes, like where's the scaffolding between them? I'd be honored to come back and talk some more. But
yeah, that sounds great. Well, you always have a welcome spot here on the show anytime you want to come on, Abby. But great to wind up the week together with you. I still have a team I'm getting ready to work with next week, but I have to meet up with the leaders later today. But this is great, giving me some food for thought in terms of what I'm going to do with the leadership team I've been working with for a while next week. And I think there's some elements in today's show that have stimulated some novel ideas for me. So thank you for your time and everything. Yeah. All right. So if folks want to connect with you, Abby, I think we put in the chat before your LinkedIn, but I'll go ahead and stick that in again. Anywhere else that people should connect with you once I find that? Here we go. So if you go to, it's Abigayle Wall on LinkedIn, but if you can see this here in the chat. Is that the best place to reach out to you if people want to connect with you?
yeah,
Okay.
I would say that's the best place.
Awesome. All right. Well, have a great day, Abby. And thanks everybody for listening in today. We'll see you next time on the Team Coaching Zone podcast. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.